Welcome to Authors at Google. I'm Mark Donner, and I'm here to introduce Barbara Probst Solomon. I've known Barbara many years as a family friend, and I've actually been learning a little bit about her amazing career in the time that we've been preparing for this visit. As a teenager, shortly after the end of World War II, Barbara did a rather radical and sort of courageous thing and went to Europe to look around and understand what had happened there at a time when going to Europe was not a luxurious trip to see the sights and enjoy good food and live in luxury. And there she got involved in the struggle against the fascist regime in Spain, helping found a magazine called Peninsula that was produced in Paris and smuggled across the Pyrenees into Spain, and getting involved in rescuing political prisoners from Spanish prisons and all kinds of amazing experiences. Coming back and becoming a world-famous writer here in the U.S. We're here to celebrate this new edition of her literary magazine, Reading Room. What's particularly interesting about Reading Room from a sort of a geek perspective is that it represents an entirely new approach to publishing in a way that isn't obvious, because you look at it and looks just like a fairly conventional collection of pieces of dead tree bound together. But what's remarkable is the production process doesn't involve conventional publishing houses. The typesetting is done by the authors, and the book is printed on demand by a service that they use. So no longer is it the case that to get something published you have to commit a lot of capital, print thousands of them and stick them in a warehouse and then hope that they sell. So there's lots of very interesting things that I think she can teach us. So Barbara.
Well, first of all, I do want to thank Mark Donner and Mickey Bausch and all of you who've come here to be with me and hear this, for coming and for giving your support. I'll probably use a mixture in my usual offhand way of what I've written and also my offhand comments. And then later on, there are books there. And as a visual has always been very important to us. These I'll leave with Google, but these are all different issues. And as you can see, we are literary, but with a big interest also in the way things look, which, by the way, has helped us. I just want to speak a little bit first about various things. Mainstream publishing, which after all my adventures in Europe as young, I came back to America, belatedly enrolled in the School of General Studies, and set out to be a writer. And so I want to discuss that. Then I want to discuss the modern technology involved. And to the end, I want to segue into a mutual discussion of some thoughts for the future, because we're always just a little peg in the moment of time going towards the next step. It'll be your next step, may not be mine. I mean, I'm 80, but still, everything is always in transition. Okay, for a moment, you know, the great bestsellers of the 19th century, of course, were Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin and Dickens, which were good books, but which had some kind of a moral point, and there was a society out there ready to receive them. Though as Lincoln said, Harriet Beecher Stowe was a little lady who practically started the Civil War. And sometimes you have good writing where writers are able to mesh their talent, their ability to write, with the social temper of their times, but not always. Just take a quick look. After a brief period of recognition, Herman Melville was virtually forgotten. Moby Dick was almost unknown until really he was reclaimed in the 1940s. F. Scott Fitzgerald got off to a great start as the bard of the jazz age, but then his career really ended abruptly in the crash, in the Depression. He wasn't the writer for those times. So it isn't just a question of ability and talent. Then, at a later point, of course, we all know the Great Gatsby. So it's hard for us to imagine that when he died in 1940, he was a has-been sort of broke writer trying to eke out a living in Hollywood, and nobody was thinking about the Great Gatsby. So things come and go. Orwell sold 3,000 copies of another classic when it was out here in the early 50s, Homage to Catalonia, which is now taught in probably every school. So it's a very up and down kind of road. Okay, Mark gave that wonderful introduction. I will come back to it. But anyway, after all of that, in my early 20s, I'm about 22, I don't know, but I came back to the United States, wanted to be a writer, although my interest in Spain never stopped. Went to the School of General Studies to get belatedly an undergraduate degree. And in one writing workshop, I took one, we were explained the do's and don'ts of how we writers would become writers, aside from our talent. Now, one rule was that you were only supposed to submit your story, magazine piece, or novel to one magazine or one publisher at a time. Now, I was stunned. We knew that publishers sometimes kept manuscript for over a year, sometimes magazines didn't reply, and I, in my manner, said, well, what kind of a dumb rule is that? I mean, it's sort of like signing a contract with someone who didn't know you existed, whom you didn't know existed, and was under no obligation to you. So right from the start, I shocked everybody in the class and the teacher because I said I was multiple submitting my work. I argued that it seemed unlikely that any one or two people who published me, if for some bizarre chance two publishers wanted my work, they would probably want it more if they thought they lost out to a competitor. Also, as I felt that I was morally in the right, I was perfectly willing to explain my reasoning in the unlikely moment that a publisher would, two publishers would want what I wrote. It never actually happened. But I should, so I didn't have to worry. But I always multiple submitted, saved myself a lot of time, watched my friends. It was incredible. They would let these books languish at a publisher. Gave them some bizarre sense of security, I think. But I do want to make clear that none of us are born like Venus straight out of a seashell. We're all influenced by our background. And I came from a family of lawyers and law professors, and I'd heard just enough legal eagle talk over the dinner table as an addition to being a lawyer. By the way, my father was a very successful and innovative entrepreneur, to feel that in this publishing world was sitting on very mushy terrain. And let me point out, my mother also was an artist, so my later interest in the visual. So, you know, we all come from someplace, and usually when we start our careers, we deny it. Most Americans are not happy with where they're born. They think they're either too poor, too middle class, too rich, too regular, too irregular. We're never suited. But anyway, we all come from somewhere. And I want to discuss this because I think it's important, even for Google, to think about this. Among the other deadly sins we, presumably fledgling writers, were warned against were vanity publishers. Although the concept of vanity publishing is not really on the minds of your generation of entrepreneurial web technology users, I think it's interesting to look at its history a bit, because I do think it held back writers that had an almost phobic fear of vanity publishing and confusion about what the term meant. And this interests me because I've been interested as to why my group, i.e. writers as distinguished from artists and other people, have been so, up until your generation, backward about pushing themselves forward. Group theater productions have always existed, Hollywood scriptwriters, they had tough unions. I lived also a bit in the art world, and artists, certainly in the last 50 years, were not hesitant to get what they wanted or to create the kinds of art galleries that would represent their kind of work. And interestingly enough, artists define themselves and their success by the sale of their work, as we know, preferably for very high prices. In those worlds, there are no such expressions as succès d'estime, which really basically meant no sales. But in the literary world, where big sales were confused with bestsellers, for a long time, it was very mushy. Although it's true what we were told, the vanity publishers, to beware of them, they were fly-by-night businesses that took the money of unsuspecting writers, promising kind of weird results. But what has to be straightened out is that vanity publishing, which was sort of one of many minor, very minor, bad little things, should not be confused with the almost inexplicable passivity of writers. These are two different things, at least literary writers. So I think we should dust it off and make clear the difference between sleazy vanity publishing and the need for writers, as do all other artists, to use their own initiative. These are two different things. Because curiously enough, literary writers, have been I thought they were very passive. Now, I became lucky. My editor for nearly all my books was Cork Smith, one of the great publishing editors. And it's true, my books were published in first-rate houses eventually. But nonetheless, I was always sticking my nose in whether it was sure I was making sure that the photograph I selected looked more the way I wanted to project myself rather than the way I actually looked, or by tramping to double days on Fifth Avenue and other major bookstores with my book under my arm, I would say, the publicity department says to contact your local bookstore. I think they were thinking of small-town bookstores. I would say, well, I'm in Manhattan. This is my local place. Would you put it in the window? They were sort of surprised, but they usually did. In other words, it's a cliche. Nothing ventured, nothing gained. But this is not the way literary writers thought. They wanted to feel they were being taken care of. And as I once said in Spain, a remark much quoted, in reality, there are no prestige publishing houses. There are prestige writers who lend publishing houses their prestige. And let us be aware of two different things. But by the 1980s, publishing, which had started out sort of a gentleman's cottage industry, with its goods and defects, was essentially over. The conglomerates had taken over. Publishers needed to show Wall Street returns. Cork and I talked it over, and interestingly, any editor or writer who was not a total retard had to understand at least a quarter of a century ago that big-time publishers now had an infrastructure which only as a minor sideline could include literary works. It was too unwieldy for this mammoth structure that was sort of an MGM structure. And then by 1986, when I covered the trial of the Nazi war criminal Klaus Barbie Leon for American publication, and for the Spanish, it was sort of like Time magazine, Cambio 16, I was then on their staff, one of their correspondents, I began to think about technology. By then, I had my first computer, but to Leon, I was able to take a little tiny portable brother, which was like on its way to being a computer. It was like a mini kind of, I mean, we'd look at it now and we'd laugh, but it did print, and you could attach it to a portable printer, a little mini thing that, again, we would laugh at. And I now could get my pieces almost instantly from Lyon to Cambio in Madrid or America overnight. As a journalist, I thought, wow, I mean, this little dinky thing, it could print like 4 pages at a time. I mean, it had that kind of capacity to hold maybe 4 or 6 pages or 8, enough for an article, you know. And I began to see the world was beginning, as I did a lot of journalism, to change. Then in, I think it was 2001, a friend of mine, literary agent Eugene Winnick, because he knew I was always nattering on about the need for little magazines, et cetera, said to come with me to this expo in Chicago. What I saw in Chicago was a demonstration of Lightning's print on demand. A book was put in one machine. It seemed to be carried through a conveyor belt to a series of machines that to me looked like laundry machines. But anyway, out would pop a book. Suddenly, when I read all the brochures and the demonstrators took us around, and I began to sense what they were doing, it flashed through my mind that this might be a possible way for me to achieve my longtime dream of having my own literary magazine. At this point, I have to confess something. My best subject, even though I was a writer, was always mathematics. So I heard my father's voice, the great entrepreneur, successful, advising me, don't worry about little luxuries, they can always be stopped. Just keep the basic nut down. I looked at these brochures. There would be no warehouse costs, no middlemen. The setup charges were minimal. If I hired a good designer, and art was important to me, I realized that the book and print type could look good. The books would go from Lightning to Ingram distributors directly to online bookstores like Amazon and Barnes & Nobles. You could also, if you got them into independent bookstores, they could be there, and basically no warehouse, no returns. And Jeannie Winkle, but then at Lightning told me that Jason Epstein of Random House and I were the first people in the literary publishing world to realize the potential, not of other things, but of print on demand. Jason was thinking books, but my mind was going in another direction. A literary magazine that looked like a magazine by that time would have cost a fortune. And I could give some time, but I really couldn't afford to lose money, despite my so-called dazzling career. My husband had died young. I had to raise 2 daughters, one of whom Mark knows, and it's my granddaughter, Catherine is over there. I had a family to support, and I managed, but I didn't have, at that point in my life, having kind of raised my kids alone, I didn't, as a writer, have the kind of money that would have permitted me to lose money. I could give my time, but I couldn't lose money. Anyway, I said to myself, distribution is already shaky. Stores that carried literary magazines were already going out of business. So I thought, what's to prevent me from making a literary magazine in a book form? one that could go easily into online, Barnes & Noble, et cetera, et cetera. If there were to be no returns and no this and no that and minimal cost, there was basically no downside. And I think at this point, different parts of my personality meshed. In my freshman year in high school, I was the only girl who had chosen to work in the print linotype machine. My mother really was a first-rate artist, and then, of course, there was my formative experience in Europe, which Mark has already covered. But still, the fact that we were able to smuggle magazines across borders, et cetera, was on my mind when I made the reading room. And I also knew how one little magazine made in cold water rooms in Paris ended up being part of Spanish history at a much, much, much later date. So Mark has discussed my life in Europe, so I'm not really going to go so much into that here now, even though you can question me more about it.
Hello. So I had a question. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about what it was like to go to Europe in 1948, and really, was it for you the kind of mentality that you seemed to have in the beginning of your literary career of nothing ventured, nothing gained? I mean, what was your real inspiration to do that?
It's a good question, and I think there are a variety of explanations. One, I think as a child I was interested in Europe. My father had been a private in the trenches, gassed in the First World War, and I always thought, if it wasn't for a certain bullet going the wrong way, I might not have existed. Okay, so that was one reference. My mother was an artist. The truth of the matter is some of my independence came from the fact that she frequently abandoned the family. And she, in the 30s at times, till World War II, would take off for Europe, generally for London. And then I had a nanny who was from Germany. And as a Jewish child, even though the nanny came over here well before Hitler, it created all sorts of things. So various things. One, the fact that I was always wondering what drew these people to Europe. Not my father, he was drafted. Another, I had a fix on that. Then, I learned a lot from the movies, like every generation. When I was in high school, the movies, if you've ever looked at Turner classic movies, were all about World War II. So this was no esoteric subject. In fact, I'm ashamed to say it looked rather glamorous, So all these things. And then I had, I think, a natural inclination to, even though it's curious, because I was a good student, but I don't think I was so school-oriented, I mean, when I was little, I had read about Thomas Wolfe, the first Thomas Wolfe, who was then a great writer from the South, convinced my parents, therefore, he was dead, to let me go to a work camp, which is what they were called then. They were cheaper. In North Carolina, in the Appalachians, in the region where they shot now, Cold Mountain, a few years ago. So I was sort of wanting to see what the Dust Bowl, or it wasn't the Dust Bowl, the equivalent, looked like. And I was then about, 10 or 11. So I think combined with things in the popular culture, which were the movies, it wasn't some great history book, the movies, the women in my family, my father's early experiences as a private, and my natural inclination to there are many kinds of writers. I would never be a great playwright, never going to be a great poet. I don't even think I was a very good short story writer. I was very good at writing what I saw, So these things Does that answer your question a bit?
We started to talk about a topic that I'm very curious about, so I'll sort of put it out here for further comments. I studied Spanish in high school and was sort of got advanced enough to be introduced to some Spanish literature. The thing that I find remarkable about Spanish literature versus almost any other language with a major body of literature is that it's largely unknown in the English-speaking world compared to Russian or French or Italian or German, where tremendous amounts of that literature is translated and sort of known by people who are not, in fact, literati. Why is that?
You're perfectly right. And what we learned as students in school essentially was not European history. We learned English history with a touch of French thrown in. And it is curious because Spanish is one of the great literatures, but aside from that, it was also, until we took Cuba back from them, the Philippines, which we also took Spanish territory, so I'm sure there's a lot of that mixed into it. But it was the Holy Roman Empire. It had more command over the world than England did. And so I know that when I got back from Europe and went to college, I was always translating in my mind. I thought, what they're teaching me is English history. There's no Don Quixote. You would never know, even to this day, you would not know, because I was listening to the talk about, on the 4th of July, the American Revolution. We know the French helped out. You would never know that more money came from the Spanish, and they helped out. I mean, for their own reasons. They had, first of all, they had pacts with the French, and they were as anti-British as the French were, so they saw it as a great investment. Now, I'm listening to these programs, and I think, hey, even though I reviewed books on this for the Wall Street Journal about a year ago, what do we know about, and apparently, and this is according to Hugh Thomas, who's a British, not a Spaniard, apparently America still, and Benjamin Franklin, still owes Spain a pot of money. I mean, so your question is well taken. And then I think it was basically, I don't know, we had England and France on our minds, basically. And then we were always at war with something Spanish later on, not then. But it and in a way, it is curious because this new issue of the Reading Room, which you can see over there, which is has really I said the iconic figures. It's really the great Spanish geniuses of contemporary Spanish literature of the last 50 years. Well, it's actually the first time they have been collected in one volume. And we know we'll get a lot of support for this issue. But the thing is, this again, it's not normal that these world-famous writers are so unknown in this country. And I'll go further and say, one reason that we were so startled by the so-called Spanish miracle recovery after Franco is that we didn't have a clue as to the huge investments and modernization that Spain already had done. You know, we didn't know.
I have two questions. One, with all the new technology and internet, it's going to become easier and easier to first present your work if you are a writer. All you need to do is to put it on the website. But also, as you mentioned, it's going to become easier and easier to actually create your own magazine because you don't need to select a couple of...
Well, I don't get the last sentence. What?
I'm
It's
saying that it's
easier?
also going to become easier to create your own magazine, literary magazine,
Yes.
and put it online.
Yes.
So I would also expect that there's going to appear and more of, say, junky magazines. So how do you view the process of selection of quality content in the future?
Okay, it depends from which point of view. Do you mean from the reader, the buyer, or the editor? Which?
Well, I mean, if I'm a reader and suppose there's a lot of magazines out there, how would I actually know which one?
It's good question, and it's sort of a dilemma. And it's not totally easy to answer. I would still say, because one of the ways that people used to select what they wanted to read or what they thought was good was through book reviewing. They could read the reviews. Now, that is so closing down. In fact, I was surprised to hear Tannenhouse of the Times Book Review to refer to what he does in the book review, and he said, and we include some literary fiction. There didn't used to be such a word because the Times didn't just do a little bit, and if they did fiction, it was literary fiction. So I think that that kind of information as to what to read, it goes through many channels. It goes through universities. In other words, it depends what your world is. Does it, even with all the technology, you're going to have to, the downside is that, which I think is really what you're asking, is that there's a lot of junk on there. And how do you avoid the junk and get to the good? And I think then you get to know, like there's certain web pages, Truthdig is one, run by Steve Wasserman, that have good reviewing sections that you can believe in. And I think through, actually, the way it was always done, through your friends, through school, through asking around, through some better, whatever the good literary review things are, you get to know for example, there's a good Jewish reviewing section. There are things for other languages. But I think that it's something that you and your generation kind of have to figure out. I mean, in my generation, we said, hey, why don't you read The New Republic? Or why don't you read this? Or have you heard of this book? But I think there is a downside, which is where your problem will be is somehow working your way and learning what not to go near, the slush pile of the web. And I think there are even web pages that address that issue. But you have to be a bit of a detective.
And the second question was, how do you feel about the new electronic book reading devices like Amazon's Kindle or Sony Reader? Do you feel that they will replace the printed content?
You know, I think that they are good. But what I think is rather than seeing a particular piece of technology as the answer, just the way I see the reading room I see it as one chink, one stage in I mean, we have all our books are digitalized. Hopefully, one point they'll go on Kindle or some other book form. You know, they are digitalized. But I think that just like the computer didn't stay in the mini computer I had in Lyon in 1986, I think it's bad to think of anything as fixed. Nothing is fixed. Everything is in transition. So it may be that, and by the way, one uses more than one technique at a time. Like the reading room has the old-fashioned ideals of little magazines, which, by the by, something like 80 or 90% of America's greatest writings, including Ulysses and Joyce, came out of little magazines, not out of that big bulk publishing. It's important. 80 or 90% of what we think are today's classic or great writers, which is astonishing. So these were little mom and pop things, many of them run by women. So we use a combination of old-fashioned techniques. In other words, when I want outreach, I mean, one of the assets I would say that I have is being a kind of well-known writer. I have friends, and we can have events and so forth and so on. So that's an old-fashioned technique. But it's never going to stop with either print on demand or Kindle books or whatever they are at this stage. You're better off in taking the best of the past and always thinking, hey, this isn't forever. This is one step along the way.
I was just wondering what it was like to be a woman in Spain in the later part of the 1940s. You know, Spain is in some ways, for good and bad, known for its sort of machismo culture. And I was wondering if you faced more opposition than you anticipated as an independent woman there, or if you expected to receive more than you did.
The short answer is that women do well in wars and resistance movements when there's nobody else around, because they're needed. And I was living in Paris, and these Spaniards were living in Paris, which was a better place to be as a woman than the United States at that time. Now, this was a sort of extraordinary little group, I would have to say. But again, the circumstances were different when everybody was sort of down and out and struggling. And though my remark to you may be flip about women do well when needed, nobody was looking at Spain. Even later on, and I used to tell my students, Sarah Lawrence says, it's good to know some stuff later on. When I was a writer back in New York, the fact that I actually knew something like the resistance or movements in Europe helped me get into American magazines that were very machista, like the New Republic, the New York Review of Books, which, by the way, in many ways, I found far more prejudiced against women than the myths of Europe. In other words, even today, with major American political women as figures, if you look at the New York Review, you look at the New Republic, even the New Yorker, you will usually find 3 women to 25 men. So I don't care what you call it, it's nuts.
You spoke a little bit about the conception of the reading room. Can you talk a little bit more about how you choose a topic, for instance, or how you choose writers and the pieces that go into it?
Yeah, that is, first of all, this was a question asked to me by friends when I made they said, you'll never find writers and agents. They didn't seem to, even in 2002, understand that was not going to be our problem. They were out of it. The publishing world, was totally out of sync with anything that was going on. How do you find writers? Well, first of all, a lot just came to us. Remember, okay, I'm going to tell you. And then I was a professor, had been at City, I had been at Sarah Lawrence. Some of our interns and some of the writing pieces came directly from there. We were all, it's not just us. Any magazine is more deluged than not, you know. And our things were always a mixture of super unknown mixed with Nobel Prize winners. We had a big issue on Kenya. This is long before Obama. And I'd say we were idiosyncratic. But from the writer's point of view, it sounds odd, but are you asking this from the writer's point of view? Or the editor's, which?
I guess more from the editor's point of view. I mean, as a writer,
Yeah.
you know, if I were to submit something to you, you would look at it and on what criteria, or how do you decide then how to put together one of these specific magazines?
Okay, well, usually what happens is that in the beginning of each issue, we usually have some things, and then depending on what writers are coming our way that we think are good, interestingly enough, even though it looks, the finished product looks as if we have carefully designated categories and one leads into another, nothing like that ever takes place. The categories come after we have enough material that we think works together. And I would say that it comes in through my editors, comes in through me, it comes in through the transom. It's a mixture, but it is totally idiosyncratic, so that suddenly you have all these things. Now, this issue we knew we were going to make a Spanish, although it's blended with American things. And suddenly I'll say, well, we don't have something humorous, or there's not enough art, or we need some more essays, and there's enough poetry. So it's kind of, I would say, in the long run, every book, and this could be for mainstream or this sort of thing, really represents the passions of the editor and the taste. There's no right or wrong. Magazines usually take on the identity and the tastes of the people who are running them and making it, which is logical.
Well, we thank you so much for coming
And
today.
thank
And we
you.
thank all of you for coming today, too. If you'd like to have your book signed, please do that. And thank you so much.
Thank you so much.